8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the Project Egg Show. I'm your host, Ben Gothard, and today we have the honor of speaking with Sabo Shen. How you doing today, Sabo?
Hey, I'm doing well. How are you?
I am doing fantastic, and I'm so excited to have you on the show today. Thank you so much for carving out the time.
Oh, no problem. I'm excited to be here.
All righty. So I really want to know, what is your story?
Yeah, where do you want me to start?
From the very beginning, and I want to know the whole story.
Yeah, so, most people today know me as the founder and CEO of Hanu Labs, and that goes all the way back to when I started college. In 1997, I was working as a stuntman. I was getting injured left and right, and our agent was giving me all sorts of different prescription pills to manage the pain. And my roommate, who was also a stuntman, never took any of those. He was just consuming cannabis. And I often thought that just smoking it, while it was helping him deal with the muscle pain, like it was damaging his lungs. So once I gave it a try, I became an instant believer in medical cannabis, but I was always thinking of healthier, better ways to consume cannabis. So from 1997 to 2010, I bought over 200 different vaporizers, and my wife got sick of me always buying them. So she said, hey, instead of buying more vaporizers, why don't you try and design one? And as you saw in my background, I worked for 5 different startups in my professional career. All 5 of them had successful exits. So I thought, hey, even though I wasn't a business major, I've learned a lot through osmosis, and, let's try to make it 6 in a row. So here I am today. I'm running my first startup in a brand new nascent industry, and it's been really exciting. Every day is a brand new adventure.
So I want to talk about a few different things here. The first of which being, how did you come to be a stuntman? How did that come about?
Yeah, so I practiced martial arts my entire life. I also am a dedicated athlete. So even though I was only 130 pounds, I was trying to make it onto the UCLA football team. And instead of working a regular job, just because I've done martial arts and was good at falling and those different types of things, there was jobs that I could do in Hollywood. And most of them were jumping through windows or being thrown off roofs. And as you can imagine, there's not really a school that you could go to train to be a stuntman. So, I was really giving up and sacrificing a lot of my body just for, $150, $200 a day. But, when you're 18, 19, 20, that's still a lot of money. And, we were hanging out with actors. So I figured, hey, this is a small price to pay to be able to be rolling around with, some Hollywood actors and actresses.
So you mentioned you've been doing martial arts for almost your whole life. What is your I'm not sure the right word, but like the style or the specialty? I'm not sure the right word to describe it.
Yeah, just the different disciplines in martial arts. And, I think, as you mentioned, I was practicing my entire life. So I started off with judo, went to karate, taekwondo, boxing. Then I really fell in love with the Brazilian martial art capoeira. And then I learned jiu-jitsu as well. So, prior to having the UFC and mixed martial arts, I was really dabbling in a lot of the different styles just because, I had a lot of different interests, and, some of them were striking. I like to wrestle as well. And capoeira really taught you how to do a lot of flips and a lot of really fancy moves that, if you're a young man and you're trying to show off to women, nothing works better than just flipping in front of them. So that was part of the impetus for learning all of these different martial arts. And, the skills just carried over into stunt work.
That's amazing. What were some of those core skills that you feel you really took from your years and years of devoting to the practice?
I think that in martial arts, more so than in any other sport, I think that because it is a combat related art, is that you cannot lie to yourself. So in business, in life, there's many people that you see constantly making the same mistake over and over and over. And you're wondering, why does this person keep making that same mistake? And many times it's because, they're telling themselves, I'm a great sales guy, or I'm an awesome graphic designer. And, they're not improving on things and not addressing their weaknesses. And in martial arts, if you're telling yourself I'm a really good striker, or I'm a really good submission artist, and you just go in and, if you're lying to yourself, you have a very high probability of getting hurt, which is why I feel like, my decision making and my ability to clearly understand what's working and what's not working and being objective, a lot of that came through martial arts. Because like I said, if you're fooling yourself, you might be just waking up and seeing stars because you're getting in the ring with people that are much too skilled for you. And in a way, especially with jiu-jitsu, I like to think of it as playing speed chess with your body with dire consequences. So, it's not just a physical activity, but the more you could kind of plan ahead and trap your opponent in chess, you could absolutely do those same things in jiu-jitsu or in martial arts as well. And the consequences of picking and making the wrong decision are much deeper. So for me, that's one of the greatest assets that I found through doing martial arts, was having quick, clear decision-making capabilities and being able to live with them.
That is so critical. And, I think, especially in the business world, we do get disciplined by the market. If things, if we're lying to ourselves, it will reflect in, the amount of customers we have, or the amount of time that we have to ourselves, how much we really have control over our time, or really how much money we make. And I think that's definitely more of a slower discipline cycle, where you may not realize it immediately. Whereas martial arts, I mean, like, if I were to go in the ring, I've had zero training, I would definitely get my ass kicked. Definitely get super disciplined very quickly. But yeah, you're so right. And being able to be self-aware and to have that objective view, man, that's so critical. What, at what point in your martial arts career did that really dawn on you that this was a really powerful asset that you had discovered?
Well, what's interesting is, so I started off doing striking arts, and it wasn't until I got into jiu-jitsu about 5 years ago that it really started to dawn on me. Because when you're striking, you could have the best strategy in the world, but the one guy just swings for the fences and connects with your face, and all of a sudden, all of that strategy falls apart. Whereas in grappling, if you are implementing your strategy, it's really hard for someone to hit that Hail Mary or home run and just reverse everything. So what I found is, and that kind of coincided with me going into my entrepreneurial portion of my life too. And ultimately, as an entrepreneur, many times you have a much higher view of your own worth, or how good your company is doing, than what reality is really like, especially when you're trying to position with investors. Or, in the case of myself, I was just really proud, and I didn't want people to know if things were going bad, and always trying to present them in a good light. And if you start hiding those things and always acting like things are positive, sometimes you just fool yourself into thinking things are better than they are, because you're saying all of these positive things all the time. And ultimately, in order to make the right decisions, you have to be brutally objective with what's going on. And, this is also on the inverse side, because many times I think that in the dark times of an entrepreneur, you could be thinking that there's no way out, even if objectively you're doing okay. I know for myself, when we were hitting singles and doubles as opposed to home runs, I was just feeling like, well, our competitor is growing at 75%. We're only growing at 30%, and feeling like we weren't doing well. But in the big scheme of things, growing 30% quarter over quarter is still really good. It's just not these home runs. And just being objective with the fact that, yeah, if you keep growing at this quarter over quarter, 3 years from now, that's a really, really big number. So don't worry about, fast forwarding things. So this objective view of things, it goes both ways. It's not to get overly cocky and overly confident, and then also not to be just down in the dumps because you're not hitting homers like Uber, Facebook, or Amazon.
I love that. It's like the ultimate balancing force is that objectivity. Because on the one side, like you were saying, if you think things are so great and you're doing so amazingly, but really you're right here, that could definitely cause trouble. And then on the other side, if you think, oh man, everything's coming down around me, this is awful, but you're really right here, that's not good either. It seems like it's like a great equalizer,
Yep.
great equalizer. It also seems to me like a lot of people have a lot of trouble doing this and deploying the self-awareness that is really necessary to like objectively move yourself forward. So I think a piece of it is probably ego. Like we probably, we have a perception of the world. And we just, we can't like get around what we think and our own perception to see what's actually there. I don't know. What do you think? Why do you think it's so difficult for people to do that?
Yeah, and in fear of sounding like a hippie, I am in the cannabis industry. And, one of the greatest things I love about cannabis is someone gave me the analogy that alcohol helps you tune out. Cannabis helps you tune in, for better or for worse. So for myself, I know that I was able to get much more objective with my behavior once I started consuming cannabis. And some people get paranoid, like, hey, how do I sound? Do I sound stupid? Am I just talking too fast? Or, a bunch of different things. And what I've come to realize, at least for myself, it was that prior to that, I was never asking myself those questions. I was just always wanted to be the smartest guy in the room, talk about subjects that I may only have surface level understanding of, but acting like I was an expert. And when I consumed cannabis, I was like, who's this intellectual narcissist just spewing all these stupid things, So, I had the added advantage of having this thing that would alter my consciousness to give me that awareness. But, another thing was just getting older and having kids and really realizing what was important in life. I grew up in California, Steve Jobs, Zuckerberg, all these like, millionaires by their 20s. I think that kind of throws off what you think, what your level of success should be. And as I got older, what I realized was, even running a company, I was just wanting to be just like those 5 CEOs that I worked for that had successful exits. And it had nothing to do with like, what does Sabo really want to do? And a lot of these were just external ways of getting some sort of acceptance. Like my dad ran a company too. So I know that played a small role into me wanting to be just like my dad. And ultimately, I think that once I understood that external validation was driving a lot of my decisions and I would rather do things that are interesting to me, then that's when I started having more self-awareness that like, hey, like having a company that is the 800-pound gorilla that has more revenue than any other company in the space, but your employees are miserable, that's not success, not to me. Like Jeff Bezos, go talk to his employees. Are they happy? It's like, for me, the measure of success is having financial success, and all of my employees are also happy. And if giving up a little bit of financial success means happier employees, we're happy to do that in our organization. And I think that, this is something that we try to promote from the top down. And a lot of it is, we find a lot of like our millennial employees just really passionate, really driven. And a lot of times they're driving because they want to impress the executives, the external validation. And we want to make sure that they're doing things because they feel that it's important for them. And self-awareness of this is, step number 1. I don't want to say, hey, go to Burning Man and do psychedelics and find yourself. That's kind of hokey and cheesy. But I also believe that instead of finding yourself, you create yourself. And that requires a lot of self-reflection. That requires a lot of honesty. Like the things that I just admitted, like, yeah, I wanted to be a CEO because I wanted the respect of, these Caucasian CEOs that I worked for. And, there wasn't a lot of Asians in senior management. There was a lot of Asian Americans like in doing the technical engineering and stuff, but I didn't see a lot in senior management. So, to understand like those were part of my motivations, and to also understand that, hey, while that motivated me now, I have a different motivation, which is what's the best thing for my family, and just, I always say, like, you always have to be asking yourself, every quarter, like just your quarterly reports that you give your investors, you have to ask yourself, am I the same person now? I tend to evolve rather quickly. And I go, all right, well, I'm 95% the same, but 5% of it has changed. And now that 5% has changed, what does that do to the direction of the company? And I think of self-awareness as something that is a continual exercise. Like me in my 20s is different from me in my 30s. And that's different from me in my 40s now. And I had to go through these rediscovery phases. And the most interesting one for me was, as I mentioned, I used to be a stuntman. And when you're a stuntman and you're doing Hollywood auditions, you're around like a lot of like really good looking people. So I became like very self-conscious, like, oh shit, here I am next to all these models. And ultimately, I worked really hard to not be self-conscious and just be the best version of myself. And then all of a sudden, fast forward to me being a CEO, all of a sudden I became self-conscious again. I was like, oh, this guy's had 2 exits. This guy's had 3 exits. I've had none. So I felt very inferior to them. But, like I said, I had to relearn the lesson. Like, I don't need to be self-conscious. And it was a lesson I learned in my 20s. And then the lesson I had to relearn in my 30s. So I guess this is a really long-winded answer to your question, which is you need to constantly work at being self-aware and being brutally, objectively honest with yourself. And this dovetails into jujitsu, right? If you're not honest with your skill level, you're just going to be waking up from being choked unconscious over and over and over again. And that teaches you quick.
Yeah, I bet it does. But dude, that was so much knowledge and such good information. I literally agree with everything that you were saying. I mean, there was not a piece of that I disagree with. And I love the part where you were talking about how like we change and we're dynamic creatures. And I love the idea of a quarterly check-in of saying, okay, well, 95% of me is the same, but this 5% that's different, that could have a very material effect on who I am and what course of action I need to take. Now, I'm curious, I believe you mentioned how when you started to focus on what really interested you, that's when you started to see some really big moving and shifting in your business and your life. And I feel like that's so critical, right? Because I mean, we could build the biggest company in the world, but if we're not interested in it, if we don't care about it, like I feel like we're probably not going to be that fulfilled. We're not going to live a very fully fulfilled life, So I love what you were saying about that. Can you talk about how that manifested itself when you made that decision to pursue that?
Yeah, absolutely. So this maybe rewinds back to, I was a political science and ethnic studies major in college. I was thinking I was going to be an immigration attorney. So I had all these ideas of not being in corporate America and doing any of this stuff and trying to be, someone that was adding to society as opposed to just being a capitalist. And ultimately, through my journey, hey, actually, can you rephrase your question? Because I lost my train of thought and I was giving the pre-story to the story I was going to tell.
Absolutely. So I believe you're talking about that interest when you started to do what really interested you.
Yes. Okay. So thank you. So I actually dropped out of law school and I was really kind of like, what am I going to do? So I started working for early stage high tech startups because I figured that would be the best way to learn. And as I was working at these companies, like I liked technology. So, I started really trying to read more and more about it, whether it was marketing automation, business process management, enterprise resource planning, all of those things. And my wife would always see me like trying to study these things. And then once I was done studying, I would go back to reading like High Times magazine and trying to figure out which vaporizer I wanted to buy. Right. So, over the course of 9 years, like I worked for 5 companies. They all had successful exits. And my wife, I was like, I don't know what I should be doing next. Should I go work for another startup? Selling software starting to get boring. And she's like, well, it's pretty obvious to me. You like smoking weed. Why don't you try designing a vaporizer? And, coming from a conservative Asian family, like getting into the cannabis industry is not just career suicide, but it's like personal family suicide, right? I wasn't too sure how they were going to react, but ultimately, I figured I could spend the rest of my life selling software that automates a process. And the biggest way that we sell the software is always telling companies like, hey, you could fire 50 employees and save this much money by running our software and have less errors. And, after a while, I just started feeling like, man, every time I benefit, someone's losing their job, you know? So I was like, all right, well, I'm not so naive to think if I quit, like someone else isn't going to take my role. But I figured as long as it's not me, and my wife was right, you know, like I tend to tell people, like, what do you gravitate towards in your free time? Is it video games? Then maybe get in the video game industry. Mine was I just love smoking joints, bongs, pipes. And, you know, for a long time, I was thinking that was like the worst and most expensive hobby because it's probably not going to go anywhere. But now that there's a cannabis industry, well, I am one of the subject matter experts. And now I get to do what I love every single day.
That's awesome. So it was embracing the seemingly at first more difficult path of, I believe you were saying, professional and personal suicide almost. That must have been really, really difficult. How did that play out within your personal life, your family?
Well, what's interesting is CNN started doing pro cannabis documentaries, and Sanjay Gupta was their chief medical advisor. So my dad's a pharmacist. So the second he saw like an Indian doctor on TV talking about the positive benefits of cannabis, he's like, hey, Sabo, look at this. And, it's been all the things that I've been telling him over the last 15 years, but sometimes you just need to see it from another expert. So that was kind of the bridge that, or the gap that was crossed with my parents. And my father-in-law is a fairly famous chemist, and he's very pro cannabis himself. So he was able to just talk to my parents and get them comfortable with it. But for me, I had gone from a guy that's never taken a business class to running sales teams at early stage startups. And, my next job, I would be a VP of sales at, some other early stage startups. So I was just on that path of just kind of rising through the ranks. And ultimately I felt like if I just kept on that path, have like a really safe, really good quality of life for my family. But ultimately what I realized was if I wasn't super happy at work, it's tough to be like a super happy dad at home. Right. So, and one of the things that I've come to realize is if you could find the things that you're passionate at, then, like Jerry Rice always said, he was training while other people were resting. And that's how I felt like when I was reading Marketo marketing automation blogs. It was like training. Whereas when I was reading High Times, that's just what I wanted to read. So, when I felt like I could find something that I was training that was just as fun as like my play, then it would be easy for me to keep up with all the people that I felt were much more disciplined or focused that could just like grind out their workouts longer than me. And, I think Naveen Ravikant, the CEO of AngelList, he said something similar, which was, if you find the thing that you're most passionate about, then it's easy to be a subject matter expert because you're always going to be looking at information that relates to that versus forcing yourself to read trade publications so that you could keep up with, the Joneses in whatever industry you're in.
This is fascinating. So let's say somebody in the audience is like, okay, I love playing video games. Video games are my thing, but I can't really make any money playing video games. Or maybe that's the existing mindset, right? What would you say? Like what would be the first step in, figuring out, okay, is this something I want to go into? How would I actually approach that? What would be those first couple of steps that you would recommend based on your experience?
Yeah, a very good question, very salient. So, I think the video game one is a great analogy because if esports was around when I was younger, I'd most likely be a pro video game player. Like I love that intensity and just everything about internet gaming. But, if you are not someone that has the skills to be a professional video game player, there's all sorts of different jobs that companies need, like in the cannabis industry, for example. A lot of my friends now that it's legal in California, are ready to jump from Google and Facebook into the cannabis industry. And they're trying to figure out how their skills translate. A lot of them, while they love consuming cannabis, they don't have deep subject matter expertise in it. But, if you're a graphic designer, you could still get a graphic design job at a cannabis company or a video game company without being an expert. But ultimately, I like to think that when you really like something, just like when you were a little kid and you really wanted something and you were trying to sell your parents on buying you, you start getting really creative with all the different ways that you could have your dream come true. So I tend to believe that if it is something that you really want, you just start finding different alternative paths in order to get in. And maybe the first two ways don't work. I know when we first started this company, like I failed like I can't even imagine how many times, or I can't remember how many times I failed, but because I was so passionate about it, it just gave me more resolve to finally figure out like what to do. And, the biggest mistake that we made was we were making like an $800 desktop vaporizer that you have to plug in when people could buy $50 vape pens. And I was just really convinced that the high end market would be, still there. But, this goes back to the objectivity is, I just had to understand that while there are people that would buy an $800 desktop vaporizer, the total available market for $50 portables is substantially higher. And despite the fact that I don't use those types of devices, in order for my company to survive, I needed to make the proper decisions there. So I know I answered your question probably in a way that was very convoluted and kind of meandered, but, hopefully that made sense.
Yeah, and look, meandering is encouraged because that's where I find a lot of the gold as is tucked away. So please meander away.
Awesome.
But I love this, this ideology of regardless of what you want to do, follow the interest, follow the passion, because you're going to be spending your time doing it anyways. You might as well get creative and figure out how to make that work for you, whether that be applying your existing skills or look, you can learn stuff on YouTube. You can go take a class if you feel like you need that sort of, like certification or a certain degree or something, if that's, that makes you feel more comfortable. But to me, it seems like making the decision to pursue that is one of the most important things, because we may not know how we're going to get there, but once we make the decision that we are going there, then the how will reveal itself.
Absolutely. And, just to take that concept one step further is, we're not all lucky enough to do the passion in our life. And even though I stated like I'm doing exactly what I want to do, there's still like a lot of administrative and operational things that I have to do. Like if it were up to me, I just like to design products all day. But I still have to run a company. I have to sell stuff. I got to work on marketing and sales collateral, approve this, that, and the other. So I've kind of taken a slightly different approach now, which is because 70% of my day I'm doing things that I don't like to do or aren't my first choice, is I found that I need to engage myself in another way. And so I think the best way that I could describe this is I used to hate to like vacuum or do any household work. I would just outsource it. We have cleaners that come, like every Wednesday, and they would clean the house, or whether it was like plumbing or any of these other things, I would always just be like, well, I'm optimized to do business. I make more money than it would cost to, if I took a couple hours to fix this, as opposed to doing my job, that there's a cost to that. So it's better to just hire people. But ultimately what I ended up finding out was doing things by myself, doing them with pride, that brings you joy too, So now I have this different thing, which is it's not so much what you do, because everything that you do repetitively ultimately gets boring, but how engaged you are with that activity. And, this isn't just work. This could go into this podcast. It's like me and you are engaged right now. I'm not thinking about text messages or emails. So when we're engaged, things are funner. When you're not engaged, time just slows down. And this engagement, we call it flow state. Like when athletes get into flow state, they say time slows down. The bucket for the hoop is like super giant size and they're just like shooting it. Or, when X game athletes are in flow state, they're doing 1080s and all them crazy tricks. And, that's the same thing as what I recommend is like, and this is why I think people love meditation is, it helps you practice being present. And when you're present with whatever you're doing, it might not be the most exciting thing, but if you're engaged, you'll have a better time doing it. And that's kind of what I started to see is it's not so much like finding your dream job, because even when you do your dream job, it's still work. That's why it's called work as opposed to play. So now I just try to change my mindset and my engagement with whatever I do. So now playing with my kids is more fun. Gardening with my wife is more fun. Typing in and inputting data in Excel is, it's hard to say that's more fun, but it's doable, So, and that's kind of like what I've been telling people now, which is, it's really hard to find the perfect job. I'm not saying don't try to find that, but another approach is we could all begin being more engaged with everything that we do. And I believe that if you are engaged and present with what you do, then we'll have less anxious people in society, less depressed people, because one of the best definitions I heard is depression is unresolved trauma from your past. Anxiety is unresolved trauma of things that have yet to happen. And how do you cure both things? You be in the present.
That's powerful. That's powerful. And I also think by engaging, and I like that you use the word like taking pride in your work, and not from a bad place of pride, but like, having a sense of, I did that and I feel good about that. Right. I think it's very healthy. It's a very healthy source of pride, or a healthy expression of pride that leads to better work. And the better work that you do, the more likely that you're going to be able to go on and move forward and succeed in doing other things. Because if you do what you currently have amazingly well, then that gives you the ability to go on to then better and better things.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And, this is one of the things that we try to preach from the top down, which is, I think everyone, when you're younger, I think everyone's like, I want to be powerful and rich. And then when you're a little bit older, you're like, you know what? Power and money, that's good, but I really want to be happy. But what I believe is that, happiness is fleeting. And what people really want to feel is fulfillment and contentness. And there's a very simple equation for that. The harder you work, the more you give of yourself into a project, the more content and fulfilled you feel when it's successful. So, we try to teach this from the top down, because when you're running a startup, things get hard, things get really difficult, but that's why the wins are so fulfilling, and I think that if you understand that all of these things that you're sacrificing is going to give you a higher level of contentment, not just this fleeting feeling of happiness, like, you could just be given a gift and you feel happy. And then once you're used to that gift, like that happiness just kind of wades. But this feeling of fulfillment makes you, I think of happiness as kind of like eating junk food, like it tastes good going down, but once it's in your stomach, it's kind of like empty calories. Whereas fulfillment is like eating like raw, organic, nutrient dense food that's really tasty, but is also really good for you too.
Yeah. It's more of a long-term approach.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And, and this kind of goes back to just teaching people certain emotional and life skills so that they could deal with the trials and tribulations of working in difficult industries. And, and that's why we went from a model of like just looking at revenue as our target of success. But it's like, well, how happy are the people that work for us? If they're not happy, then, it's hard to feel content. We could be happy that our bank accounts are growing, but if our employees are miserable, like it's hard for me to feel like I'm fulfilling, my purpose in life. And my purpose is to show that there's a way to run a successful company, do it without interfering with any of your morals, and also having a lot of fun. Like I know me growing up, I believe that in order to be successful, you couldn't have a family, like my father also traveled a lot. And, I saw like how people working 70 to 80 hours a week were being glorified and really kind of worshiped at work. And ultimately, when these people go home, they're just exhausted. They're not able to give their wife, the best version of themselves, or their kids the best version of themselves. So, we're looking at our measurements like a lot differently. And we feel that because we do it this way, we have employees that are much happier to work harder for us, because, we're not just looking at this singular thing of revenue and that being the king of all KPIs that we're looking at our company. It's all of these things. And I think with the younger generation, people are starting to realize that he who dies with the most toys does not win. He just dies, And one of the other things that I've been looking at is, just talking to older senior citizens, whether in the cannabis space, a lot of seniors are really looking at cannabis to improve the quality of their lives. And you know how many people have told me they wish they worked more?
How many?
0. There's never been one older person that was like, Sabo, I wish I worked more. Everyone's like, I wish I understood that work and money were important, but not the main thing in life. And I think that, right now in the society that we're at, there's certain industries where it's really hard to have this like holistic way of like making sure the employees are happy and revenue is there. But the cannabis industry is like this newer industry where, a lot of the people were healers that were willing to break the law in order to get this medicine to people. So at least for right now, we have this really cool industry where, revenue doesn't have to be king. And as this industry begins to organize and mature, I'm hoping that we could keep some of this good vibes going so that, the generations that come after us don't think that working 80 hours a week and traveling all the time is the best way to have a fulfilling life.
Well, to be fair, I think a certain type of traveling is pretty sweet, and that definitely could lead to a lot of fulfillment. But I know what you mean. I know what you mean.
Yep.
So at this point, it seems like you've done a lot of introspection. And I'm curious to know, what questions are you working on now? Like, what things are unanswered for you that you think about that are on your mind all the time?
Oh, well, I think that the biggest questions that are running through my mind all the time is, as I was telling you, the cannabis industry is in a transition. It used to be a bunch of mom and pop shops or small artisanal manufacturers that were the main players. But now, we have Constellation Brands who invested $4 billion into Canopy up in Canada. Altria, the parent company of Philip Morris, invested $12 billion in which company? Pax's parent company, Juul. So, we're starting to see a lot of different tactics now. So, market share is king. Margins, which used to be king, are no longer important. So there's a lot of people right now that are getting products on the shelves. They're not worried about margins. They're just trying to buy market share. And that's a very interesting game. And for us, there's a part of me that is, as I mentioned, like we don't look at just revenue at our company as the key indicator. But when you're competing against companies that are only looking at revenue, like they're making some decisions that are only good for producing revenue. And that makes it more difficult for us to keep running this type of business model where revenue might not be the number one priority, but making sure everyone's happy and there's revenue. So, there's a part of me that's always kind of thinking like, hey, like when you go from the minor leagues to the major leagues, they're kind of playing by a different set of rules. And if you're not playing by them, you may get set back down to the minor leagues, right? So that is one of the things right now that I'm constantly thinking about, which is we got to make sure that while we are trying to create the best environment possible for everyone, that we don't get lapped by these larger companies that are doing things that are 100% revenue based.
Well, there have been times in history, and of course, that is such a good question to be asking, I believe. I also think there have been times in history where we've seen in industry and in sports a lot of the time where in the major leagues, everybody's done something a certain way. And then so a newcomer comes in and does it a different way and just absolutely wipes the floor with them. There was a gentleman, his name escapes me, but it was in the Olympic sport where you jump over the thing. And
Yeah, the high jump.
The high jump, yeah.
Yep.
And so for a time, people were all doing it. Now people do it backwards, right? But they didn't always do it that way. There was a time when people were trying to jump over it,
Like
forwards. Yeah, yeah. And so the first person who did that totally changed the game, and I mean, absolutely changed the way the entire sport was. He changed the rules. It was awesome. It was awesome.
I mean, that's what we're hoping for, like a lot of the our employees are millennials and they're younger, and I think their expectations of what a holistic quality of life is a bit different, so I'm hoping that we could run this model, show people that it could be successful, and hopefully other people will want to run that model. And even if it's not because they want their employees to all be happy and enjoy themselves, and it's just for the bottom line, well, at least their employees are happy and enjoying themselves. So I say, whether you want to do it or not, I think it's a good idea. And if we could, have a really big successful exit, then I could speak confidently, like, this is possible. And at least for myself, we haven't exited yet, but we're doing good enough, like I'm not like, I want to be hitting home runs. We're hitting singles, doubles, and triples, but guess what? We're still scoring. So, and like I said, there's plenty of studies that support this. Once you get to a certain level of economic safety, like having more money does not make you happy, right? So we're already at that level, and now we're just trying to fine tune and figure out if, a business model like this, where you're really taking into consideration the overall mental health of your employees, is a model that will go forward. And, I know that there's places like Google or Facebook that have, cafeterias that feed you, and places where you could get, massages and stuff like that. And, I think all those things are cool, but what I'm really talking about are executives and employees really, really interacting with each other, and not just giving them like all these like really cool, like, the icing on the cake, but making sure the cake is also really good itself, and helping them understand that this is important to management. And it's not just something that we say because it sounds good right now and we have a bunch of young employees, but something that we believe and execute in as well.
That's awesome. Well, Sabo, I want to thank you so much for coming on the interview today, and for sharing some time with me. I really do appreciate it, and I'm very grateful that you would carve out the time to do that. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Absolutely. And so I just have one more question for you. Then we'll go ahead and wrap it on up.
Yep.
I want to know, what question should I be asking you that I just wouldn't think to ask?
Ooh, really good question. What brings you absolutely the most joy in life?
And can you answer that for me, please?
Well, we're doing it. Being engaged with other people, sharing ideas, learning new things. And you know what? I really love learning, speaking to people like yourself. I mean, when you reached out to us and I looked at what Project Egg is doing, I felt very blessed that you would invite me on the show. And, like I said, being 100% engaged with you, like, I don't know how long we've been talking, but I know that these things usually go for an hour or so. And it felt like it was just 5 minutes. So I just felt like we had the best time speaking here. And, this is the thing that I try to recreate all the time with the interactions that I have with even the people that I'm negotiating with, which is, I know you're trying to get the best thing for your company. I'm doing the same, but I'm going to be authentic with you. I'm going to look you in the eye. I'm not going to be thinking about 100 other things other than what we're trying to accomplish. And that's what brings me a lot of joy.
Awesome. Well, again, thank you so much for coming on the show, and for sharing a little bit about your life and how you think and all about Sabo. So I really do appreciate that. And to everybody who's watching and listening, I want to thank y'all very, very much. Your time is very valuable too. So I'm grateful that y'all choose to share some of it with us today. So thanks for sticking around to the end. I love y'all very, very much. Y'all are the reason that I do this. So thank you, Sabo. Thank you. And I will see y'all on the next episode.
You're the man, Ben. Thank you.